Imagine that you lived in a country where petrol was so cheap that it was practically free. Well, in Venezuela, until recently, petrol cost 2 cents a litre and was so cheap that you could fill up your tank for less than $1. In theory, this sounds great, but in Venezuela, the reality is far different. In Venezuela, queuing up to fill your tank can take hours, as the country is constantly facing fuel shortages. But these shortages are just the tip of the iceberg, where the incessant hyperinflation, escalating levels of hunger, food insufficiencies, and huge waves of immigration mark one of the worst economic crises in Venezuela's recent history. But things were not always this bad. In fact, Venezuela had consistently ranked highly in terms of its GDP per capita compared to other countries in the Americas, with a strong middle class emerging since the establishment of its democratic government in the late 50s. The quality of life for many in the country was pretty good. But in recent times, Venezuela as a country has suffered. So how did one of the once wealthiest nations in South America get into this position? And why does this all relate back to petrol practically being free? There's no denying that Venezuela is rich in oil resources, and even this is an understatement. Recent estimates state that the country holds more of the black gold than Russia, Iran, Canada, and even Saudi Arabia, approximating that Venezuela contains over 300 billion barrels of oil beneath its soil. This is enough to satisfy China's petroleum requirements for 55 whole years, and at $70 a barrel is worth $21 trillion. That is the equivalent of 7 Apple corporations, 14 Googles, or 84 Elon Musks. And what's more is that this oil isn't hard to extract either. Unlike US shale or Canadian tar sands, Venezuela's geology, located above the hydrocarbon-rich La Luna Formation, means that more simple conventional methods of drilling can be used to extract this oil. So how does a country with the largest crude oil reserves in the world constantly face fuel shortages? Over the last 20 years, a combination of factors have led Venezuela into this predicament. Corruption at several levels of its leadership, crippling sanctions imposed by the US, and very, very bad government financial policies. At the heart of Venezuela is a very fragile economy. Having huge oil reserves is great, but when exporting this resource constitutes 80% of your economy, it can cause problems. When oil prices are high, huge revenues are created and the Venezuelan currency is strong. But when oil prices are low, the opposite effect ensues. And as oil is a highly volatile commodity, so too is the Venezuelan economy. In 1976, the Venezuelan leadership decided to nationalize the country's oil resources, which was the next in a series of policies that sought to nationalize all of the country's petroleum reserves in the early 70s. Instead of foreign private companies operating the various sites and wells, a state-owned company was created to take over these tasks of exploration and extraction. Being controlled by the state, the president of the country has huge controls on how this company's profits are spent. And in 1999, when Hugo Chavez took office, he began using revenues from this company to fund various social programs, including a program of subsidized petrol. After his death, President Nicolas Maduro took over his presidential powers, carrying on this legacy of social spending and subsidization. But these policies, which rely on consistently high oil prices, were not exactly sustainable. Over Chavez's reign, the state company was not run well either. Employees who disagreed with Chavez's policies were fired, leading to a loss of expertise within the company. Executives and politicians were constantly involved in corruption schemes where billions were siphoned from the company, whilst exploration of new resources were lackluster and not enough to replenish the declining reserves. As oil prices began to decline in 2014, the industry was generating less revenues for government spending, and the leadership's solution to this was to print the difference and borrow themselves out of the situation. Venezuela's debt to GDP went from 5.1% in 2016 to a peak of 320% in 2020, whilst the country's inflation rate went from an already high 20% in the early 2000s to over 50,000% in 2018. Instead of the government holding themselves accountable for this issue, which prompted them to place nationwide price controls on goods, making the situation even worse, they actually blamed their own citizens, citing that they were buying and hoarding too many goods, which was causing the country's issues. Chávez's rule led the country towards authoritarianism, as he ended term limits and began controlling the country's Supreme Court. These moves caught the attention of other countries like the US, whose previous administrations imposed sanctions on the country in retaliation to the leadership's authoritarian actions. Many of these sanctions targeted the country's oil industry, where US individuals and corporations were prohibited from working or transacting with the state-owned oil company. This, on top of the hyperinflation and mass emigration of specialists in the field, led to the country's oil production inevitably falling, as production could simply not be maintained. From the early 2000s to recently, Venezuela's crude oil production declined from nearly 3.5 million barrels a day at its peak to 500,000 at its low. This has led to a negative spiral where less production brings in less revenue for government spending, further impacting production. Venezuela's situation got so bad in 2017 that the state company could not afford the safety inspections and services required to allow a fleet of their tankers to even enter international waters. The overall deterioration of Venezuela's oil industry has also led to higher rates of industry-related injuries and oil spills during the last decade, where NASA's Earth Observatory estimated that between 2010 and 2016, there were 40 to 50,000 oil spills from the country's oil operations, where reports state that spills from the country's derelict petroleum infrastructure is plaguing the country with environmental and ecological challenges. All the while, the country's government has kept their petrol subsidy policies, continuing to sell it for only 2 cents a litre. And this is all despite the country not having adequate refining capacity to produce the petrol itself, or even being able to import petrol from many countries due to sanctions. Venezuela's lack of refining capacity is one of the reasons why the country has suffered from fuel shortages. But the heavy consistency of Venezuelan crude means that it's difficult to refine into petrol or diesel. This, in conjunction with the country's deteriorating refinery infrastructure, has meant that production of fuel could not keep up with demand. The fuel subsidies, in theory, give the population access to cheap fuel, and was a way of helping to share the country's resources with its population. But in reality, the old fuel infrastructure, broken pumps, and lack of domestically refined petrol meant that people didn't really have access to this fuel anyways. And what little petrol was available at this price was vulnerable to groups smuggling it to nearby countries to sell at prices closer to market value. This made huge profits for the smugglers, but didn't exactly help the people of Venezuela. Today, the situation, although not great, is looking slightly better for the Venezuelan population. Inflation is still way too high, but not as crazy as it has been in the past. People are managing this by saving and transacting in more stable currencies like the US dollar or Colombian peso. But people on fixed salaries denominated in the Venezuelan currency are still struggling to afford even basic necessities. Oil production is slowly rising and is now at around 800,000 barrels per day. The lifting of certain oil-related sanctions by the Biden administration has helped to increase production, as US companies have been able to resume operations in the country. but these numbers are still far away from what they were at their peak, showing that this problematic lack of oil production can't be solved overnight. In 2005, a top Venezuelan energy minister stated that it would take at least 15 years to rebuild the technical skills lost from the mass firings of the early Chavez administration. And 18 years later, Venezuela's oil industry still hasn't recovered. Although petrol is still available for those eligible at a subsidized rate of 2 cents a litre, for the majority of the population, petrol is now fixed at 50 cents a litre. Still cheap, but puts less pressure on the government to provide this fuel for free. Despite this, the country is still having to import more easily refined lighter crude mixtures from countries like Iran to make up for their own refinery issues, but this has helped to reduce fuel shortages in the short term. The government spending reforms and recent growth in its economy has led to their debt to GDP levels falling to a still elevated 250%, but much less than previously. But restoring their crude oil outputs of past won't come cheap, especially when their industry has been neglected for so long. A plan by the Venezuelan National Oil Company stated that they would need $58 billion to recover and upgrade oil production infrastructure to reach levels of 1998, before ex-President Chavez came to power. The road to recovery for Venezuela will be long and challenging, where political leadership, management of the country's resources, and global energy prices will dictate the future of the country. But the will of the Venezuelan people who have endured this hardship to guide the country forward and into brighter pastures will be the ultimate determinant of Venezuela. Thank you for watching Olive Stripe Productions. If you enjoyed this video and want to see future videos on a wide range of topics covering energy, geopolitics, and our world, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to be notified of future videos.